But I want to go back to SCMS. My first SCMS, Bill mentioned 1972, 72, 73. I was working on my master's at UCLA on my husband's sabbatical with a 3-year-old child, and that's another reason I didn't join their Maoist cell. At the very first SCMS meeting I went to, I wasn't a member, I sort of came as a faculty wife, but it was astonishing. First of all, there were only about 40 people. It was at UCLA, and in terms of women, there were 2 nuns who never said a word. There was a Birgitta Steen who had, my God, she was really hot, written a book on Ingmar Bergman, and it was a Scandinavian scholar. And then there was another woman who the next year defected to UFVA, the University Film and Video Association, for those of you who don't know. So it was a very interesting configuration, and they were still voting people. You needed a sponsor to get into it, and the following year I became a member, and then very quickly treasurer, where I collected money. I wouldn't let people into the business meeting. They actually wanted to go, and they hadn't paid their dues, and this was all done on index cards, okay? But it's at that time, and again, this is impossible to imagine at this moment, when you can't possibly even read enough for the articles and research that you're working on. You could read everything in the field, everything. All the journals, all the books. And there weren't that many publishers who published film material. That was not a trade. Prager, I don't think they're in business anymore. A.S. Barnes, I mean, publishers you've never heard of. So that was the 70s. Then there was, I'm pointing out this conference in 1974, which was a high Marxist psychoanalytic. It was at the point where there was a lot of, here and there was continental theory creeping in. By the 1980s, I remember being at an SCMS at NYU. It was the first time there was a very large contingent of graduate students at that conference. Graduate students had been frowned upon as members of the society. They weren't ready yet. And it's telling that Bill Nichols introduced me, because I remember it was an evening session, very hot, in a room at NYU, where Bill Nichols presented his style and grammar in the movies, and Nick Brown presented the spectator in the text on the rhetoric of Stagecoach, and there was a third, more traditional scholar. And when the questions came up, both Bill and Nick, who had used a certain theoretical approaches, were asked questions and answered a bit more vernacularly. And pandemonium broke out because someone got up and said, well, you just explained what you did in like ordinary language. At which point, some of the graduate students who had been silent up until then just ripped into what had been traditional film studies. And that was sort of the birth of semiotics and psychoanalytic theory and a critical theory and so on. I mean, in terms of really, really a very incendiary meeting. And also graduate students coming into the society and making a real difference. I got my PhD, I actually completed my PhD in 1984. I started it 4 years earlier when I turned 40. I was what Santa Cruz called a re-entry woman. There was this, always a re-entry woman. There were years between my BA and my MA and my PhD. And I moved to Santa Cruz in 1981. My dissertation was the first iteration of Address of the Eye. And I had already published the science fiction book, which I did as naively as my master's thesis at UCLA. I had no idea you didn't write a book. I really didn't. And that was my introduction. I'd heard the word phenomenology. I had no idea what it meant before my doctoral program, which I started in 1979, 80, that year. And my son knew the word, though, because he confused it when he would watch Sesame Street. They used to have those little Muppets that would sing phenomenon and for years that was phenomenology to my son. I don't know if he's clarified it any further. And scoot ahead to the 1990s. I remember being, at a very contentious SCMS meeting where it was a business meeting in the 1990s, I can't tell you which year precisely, when there was this huge debate about whether the society should change its name, add to it, by either using television or video in the name. And no one could quite agree on whether television was a subset of video or video was a subset of television. And then they went to how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. What happened was nothing happened. And I would just point to the changes in the field, whereby our name was changed not that long ago, well after it should have been. And there wasn't a peep out of anybody. It was perfect, the Society for Cinema and Media Studies. The society over time changed, obviously. Not only did the numbers become larger, the conferences longer, but particularly in the period from the 1990s to the present, there was no kind of hegemonic approach that was better than any other. For a long time, psychoanalytic theory dominated the panels. For a long time, sort of neo-Marxist readings did as well. And quite frankly, I don't think any particular approach should dominate. One of the great pleasures of society at the present moment, and it's been that way for a while, is somebody and I remember a panel where someone did an analysis of images of missing children on milk cartons. It got accepted as a paper. And it's an interesting paper as well. The fact that during this period we have expanded to accommodate not only digital culture in all of its forms in terms of media, but also comics and video games and whatever, in fact, seems part of our field. And I know we're adding, I think the Cinema Journal meeting last night, the first essay on radio is going to be in Cinema Journal at some point soon. During this time, I wrote it in the late 80s. It was written in the 80s, it wasn't that late. I had written The Scene of the Screen about the differences between, as well as the connections between electronic and photographic, cinematic and electronic culture. And during that time at UCLA, with a colleague who I figured could teach me how to actually do any of this stuff, like with my hands, a course called Issues of Electronic Culture. And there was no literature then, really. There was very, very little available. So I found some philosophy, put it into the class. This was with Steve Namber, but I did learn, if rather nauseously, to negotiate Vertus 3D, which is like Datesby also. I got lost in layers. I was always erasing things at the wrong layer. We weren't even wired for the internet at school yet. But the whole phenomenology of technology really interested me and still does. This was also a period where my work on embodiment that led to carnal thoughts, which was always there anyway, issues of embodiment came to the fore, and I thank, in many ways, cultural studies, the emergence of cultural studies, feminism and their interest in the body for providing a previous kind of context for that. The thing that today that I think is a problem within our field, because it's certainly not the variety of topics, it's not the numbers of scholars, it's even not the number of jobs, is writing. And I do want to touch on writing. And the first thing I want to say is that writing is our medium. It's our medium, that's what we do. We do not make films, even if some of you make films. But this society, what it represents, the kind of research, even if one does digital essays and so forth, basically, we write. We go to meetings, we teach, which is a pleasure for me. We edit, we sit in meetings again, but primarily our task is writing. And I personally think, and maybe I'm in a situation when I teach, that I find really problematic, which is students, really brilliant students, I'm talking about graduate students, because undergraduates do have certain opportunities for writing, and they're writing sections of large classes, although how much that goes on now, I don't know. But graduate students, brilliant minds, are able to talk a good game, but when it comes down, in many cases, to actually putting a coherent argument together, to use language, to recognize that, being precise requires a vocabulary. It actually requires going to the OET, which is an exciting adventure because every kind of list of usages of words contain the words opposite. It's having, if you have one, a poetic sensibility. It's all those things, and we don't teach it. We teach it on the fly, or we teach it at too late a moment when somebody's writing a prospectus. I do line readings of everything, which is a bit nuts, but I can't not. I really think that part of our mission is to teach writing. And by that, I mean argument, rhetoric in the deepest, the most philosophical sense of not only being persuasive, certainly not ornamental, but understanding tropes, understanding that the structure of language itself models, or can model, if you think about it, not only experience, but can lead to amazing insights. And at this point, I want to quote, it's the only thing I am going to quote, from a colleague who I only met once. He's a senior scholar named Brian Atterbury, who actually, this was his acceptance speech for an award for science fiction at a conference. And he said something that several things actually, but I want to point to one particularly. He says, certainly essays are different from fiction, but good sentences are good sentences. Specific, concrete, verb-driven, grounded in experience, anchored in the senses. There is no reason critical writing can't be entertaining. My God, do we have, and this is me, not him, do we have to be sober to be serious? I mean, that's, all right. Nobody actually forbids us, this is him again, to develop personal voices, to tell jokes, to generate suspense, except graduate students shouldn't try to do that. To make verbal music. These are writerly techniques, and they're not mere ornaments, but they are, in fact, and here I think he's spot on, enablers of thought. A pun can be the germ of an idea. A reversal of a phrase can open new dimensions, and you better keep writing your paper. All writing is discovery, all writing is creative, all writing is autobiography, whether you use the word I or not. in that it traces a journey and an evolution of the self. And all writing is hard work. He ends this passage by saying, boy, do I feel this and nobody believes me. This is a painful truth for someone who is basically lazy. I hate to write and will do almost anything to avoid it. And my friends know that I bitch and moan and whatever when I'm in my process before I actually sit down and start working with the problem itself. And it's always hard. Writing is hard work, which is why so many people don't want to do it. I clean my house beforehand, I go to the grocery store. I mean, I do anything. But when I'm writing, there is nothing better in terms of really finding out what you think. And this is even if you thought it out beforehand, because it's the words and the structures and the way that you put things together that in fact illuminate even further what you were trying to do. So I'm astonished that I'm standing here, I really am. I've had a kind of quirky career. I was always doing things nobody else was, and I suppose you've all caught up with me. I didn't think I was going to do that. But I was very lonely for a period of time, and it's this organization that kept me going in many ways. I do want to end, though, instead of saying, you like me, you really like me, what comes to mind is what Ruth Gordon said when she accepted her Oscar. She was then the oldest person to have ever been given an Oscar. She was in her 80s. Christopher Plummer apparently beat her out this past year. But she got the Oscar and she said, well, this is very encouraging. So